Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary bedrooms of medieval royalty, where power, lust, and absolutely no concept of boundaries collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. King John of England, also known as John Lackland and informally the worst dinner guest in British history, is best remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow still finding time to be wildly inappropriate with most of the nobility's daughters. John's reign 1199 to 1216 was a masterclass in how not to behave in public office. Politically, a disaster. Personally, somehow worse. John didn't just take lovers, he took them. He was notorious for kidnapping noble women, imprisoning them in royal castles, and entertaining them until they were either married off elsewhere or conveniently forgotten. His favorite technique for breaking up powerful families wasn't battle. It was seducing the wife, alienating the husband, and then charging him double taxes. Efficient. Chroniclers were so uncomfortable with John's behavior that even biased medieval scribes, people who routinely ignored witch trials and floggings, wrote things like he was not temperate with women and he did not abstain from wives and daughters. That's medieval, for he made the Christmas party deeply awkward. At one point, John reportedly had 30 mistresses on official record. That's not romantic. That's a staffing issue. Several nobles complained directly to the crown that John was abusing their hospitality, which is a polite way of saying he slept with everyone, including the serving staff and possibly the family goat. His behavior was so bad it nearly started a rebellion. Not because of taxation or war, but because half the barons were afraid to leave their wives unattended during royal visits. One baron refused to meet John unless his entire household was locked up first. That's diplomacy. 13th century style. And yet, in true royal fashion, John never saw a problem. He considered himself irresistible. There's no evidence for this outside of his own letters. But when you're king, delusion comes standard. In the end, King John left behind a kingdom in turmoil, a legacy of distrust, and possibly several children no one talked about at court. He was the kind of king who made people invent democracy just to keep him away from their families. Not the worst monarch in history, but definitely the one you'd never let babysit. Charles V, 6th of France, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422. And yes, that nickname was earned, not given lightly at a drunken banquet. He began his reign with promise, young, handsome, capable. Then things took a turn. He started forgetting who he was, attacking his own knights, and at one point believed he was made of glass, insisting his servants wrap him in blankets so he wouldn't shatter while walking. Not exactly the image of kingly strength, but impressive in terms of creative paranoia. Now, most kings who believe they are fragile glass figurines usually avoid scandal. Not Charles. He somehow managed to juggle a royal mistress, a paranoid delusion, and civil war all at once. A multitasker, his long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to manage the court, while Charles did things like run screaming from mirrors and refuse to bathe for fear the water might dissolve him. Meanwhile, his mistress, Odette de Sam, was quietly moved into the palace, introduced to everyone as his comfort, which was medieval code for "Don't ask questions, just smile." Odette, for her part, stayed with Charles during his most unhinged years. She must have had the patience of a saint or the property rights of a queen. She reportedly brushed his hair, listened to his glass-based ramblings, and helped him put on multiple layers of padded clothes so he could sit down safely. Nothing says passion like strapping your royal lover into a pillow suit. But Charles wasn't just eccentric behind closed doors. He also hosted court entertainments where things went horribly wrong. During one infamous event known as the Bal d'Irden, he and his friends dressed as wild men in flammable costumes and danced around with torches. Naturally, someone dropped a flame and several of them burned alive. Charles survived, but his dignity did not. Despite everything, Charles fathered 12 children, several during episodes of apparent lucidity, or at least enough lucidity. Royal chronicles don't clarify whether he remembered their names, but one can assume that naming a child not made of glass was discouraged. Charles V/6 ruled France into ruin. But more impressively, he managed to make mental illness, royal scandal, and medieval pyrotechnics, all part of the same tragicomic package. And somehow they still let him wear a crown. Peter the Cruel, also known as Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were with him or under a floorboard because of him, ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369. His idea of romance was a curious blend of royal charm, obsessive jealousy, and the occasional politically inconvenient murder. His early love life wasn't exactly Shakespearean. He fell for a noble woman named Maria de Padilla, whom he may or may not have married in secret. The secrecy part is key, mostly because he was also being married off to other women for alliances, which made things slightly awkward. One of those women was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman he married, then locked in a castle 3 days later. She spent the rest of her life imprisoned because Peter decided Maria had prettier hair. Or maybe he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Either way, it was an aggressive form of ghosting. Maria, meanwhile, became his lifelong obsession. Even when he married other women, she remained his favorite. When she died, Peter reportedly wept for days and then ordered that she be declared his legal wife retroactively, just to confuse everyone and possibly to justify the fact that she had already given birth to 4 of his children. But Peter's passions didn't stop at unannounced annulments and royal kidnapping. He was known for falling in love violently, which is not poetic. It's just dangerous. One of his mistresses, Dona Juana, tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, as were several of his political enemies and cousins, and occasionally people who made eye contact at the wrong moment. Contemporary accounts mention that Peter sometimes watched executions from his balcony while lounging with a mistress. That's not charming sociopath. That's HBO villain with poor impulse control. But even with all the drama, the Castilian court was never boring. Gossip flowed faster than wine, and Peter's relationships blurred the line between passion and vendetta. His idea of romantic gestures included surprise weddings, surprise divorces, and the occasional surprise stabbing. Eventually, Peter was killed by his own half-brother in a rather symbolic act of family therapy. But his reputation as one of Europe's most aggressively unromantic romantics lives on. If love is a battlefield, Peter brought siege equipment. Edward II of England ruled from 137 to 1327 and is best remembered for 2 things: losing to the Scots at Bannockburn and showing more affection to his male favorites than to his actual queen. One of those things was considered treason. The other was considered controversial dinner conversation. Let's begin with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion, rumored lover, and full-time fashion icon. Piers wasn't just close to Edward. He was elevated to positions of ridiculous influence, gifted estates, titles, and jewelry that frankly matched none of his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers wore more sparkle than the royal regalia, and upstaged the Queen, which is a bold move when your survival depends on nobles not hating you. Spoiler, they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was understandably furious. She came with political expectations and a generous dowry, neither of which included sharing the throne with her husband's bestie/possible boyfriend. Edward, however, remained devoted. When the nobles demanded Piers be exiled, Edward sulked, sent him away, then brought him right back. Like a teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the barons had enough and executed Piers. Edward was devastated. Think full-on royal meltdown. Mourning clothes, public weeping, the whole medieval soap opera. His grief, however, did not lead to self-reflection. It just made room for a new favorite. Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh made Piers look like a subtle footnote. He wasn't just Edward's advisor. He was basically the second king. Land, titles, entire counties. Hugh got them. The rest of the nobility got angry. Isabella by this point switched from annoyed wife to full-blown vengeance avatar. She teamed up with a lover of her own. Edward's enemy naturally invaded England and overthrew her husband. Edward was imprisoned, stripped of his crown, and possibly murdered by red-hot poker. Yes, that rumor exists. No, we're not discussing the physics of it. Let's just say medieval revenge was rarely subtle. Edward II's reign was less about governance and more about personal drama, so intense it could be a reality show. If the Plantagenets had Netflix, his season would have been banned in 3 countries. His mistake? Mixing politics with passion, ignoring everyone else, and assuming royal power meant nobody could touch him. Turns out, everyone could eventually. Waslaus of Bohemia ruled in the late 14th century, though ruled might be a generous term. He technically held titles like King of the Romans and King of Bohemia, but his real achievements were more along the lines of public nudity, aggressive drinking, and starting fights in his own palace. If you're thinking of good King Weslaus from the Christmas Carol, wrong guy. That was his ancestor. This Weslaus, not good, not even vaguely decent. He began with promise, crowned as a teenager, intelligent, multilingual, and capable. But somewhere along the way, he decided the royal wine cellar was more useful than the treasury and started governing from the bottom of a goblet. Wislaus developed a reputation for hosting multi-day drinking sessions, where policy decisions were made between rounds of mead and inappropriate limericks. His advisors began carrying flasks, not to drink, but to survive negotiations. At court, debates often ended with someone flipping a table or being challenged to a duel using breadsticks. He also developed the charming habit of streaking through the castle, sometimes mid-meeting. 1 Chronicler records Wenceslaus delivering royal edicts completely naked, except for a sword belt. His justification: clothes are for the timid. Hard to argue with that kind of logic when the guy with the crown also has a long sword and no pants. Romantically, he favored barmaids, laundresses, and occasionally nobles' wives, though he seemed more invested in their beer recommendations than their feelings. Affairs weren't scandalous at his court. They were practically job interviews. One noble accused him of seducing his sister. Stanislaus shrugged and offered him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they'd had enough of his royal vodka and removed him as king of the Romans, a polite way of saying, "You're fired, but we're pretending it's political." Even his own brother called him useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Still, Stanislaus somehow reigned in Bohemia for decades. His people tolerated him the way one tolerates a loud uncle at a wedding, with eye rolls, careful seating plans, and lots of alcohol. In the end, he left behind a shaky kingdom, a flooded wine cellar, and a royal legacy best summed up as he ruled like every day was his last hangover. Henry VIII of England is what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked hormones. He ruled from 159 to 1547 and spent most of it either getting married, getting divorced, or getting mad at the Pope for not supporting his questionable dating decisions. You've heard the rhyme: divorced, beheaded. Died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that barely scratches the surface of Henry's royal rom-com turned horror series. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon. Wife number 1. After 20 years of marriage, Henry decided God was mad at him for not having a male heir. Naturally, the solution wasn't introspection. It was annulment, excommunication, and the creation of an entirely new church. He invented Anglicanism just to date someone else. That's not devotion. That's pettiness with a cathedral. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Henry wrote her love letters full of passion, obsession, and really bad poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, but no sons. This led to her arrest for adultery, witchcraft, and possibly giving side at court. She was beheaded. Henry moved on with the emotional reign of a potato. Jane Seymour followed, producing a male heir, Edward, before tragically dying from childbirth complications. Henry mourned her deeply, by which we mean he waited a respectful 11 days before scoping out wife number 4. Next came Anne of Cleves, who Henry chose based on a flattering portrait. In person, he said she looked like a Flanders mare. That marriage lasted 6 months and ended in what we'd now call a no-fault divorce and a politely written Yelp review. Catherine Howard, wife number 5, was much younger and considerably less discreet. She was executed for adultery, though honestly, it's hard to blame her. Being married to Henry at that point meant dealing with gout, paranoia, and a man who could barely walk, but still insisted he was a gift to women. Finally, Catherine Parr, wife 6, who wisely outlived him by being literate, patient, and excellent at dodging accusations. By the time Henry died, he'd bankrupted England, eaten half its livestock, and turned the royal court into a soap opera, where heads rolled more often than wedding bands. In short, Henry VIII loved hard, ruled harder, and left a trail of drama so legendary it's still being turned into musicals. Francis I of France, ruling from 1515 to 1547, was the walking embodiment of the Renaissance, cultured, charming, sophisticated, and absolutely incapable of keeping his trousers buttoned. To his credit, he was a great patron of the arts. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built magnificent palaces, and helped turn France into a cultural powerhouse. But while the painters were painting and the poets were poeting, Francis was busy seducing anything with a pulse and a title. His court was famous, or perhaps infamous, for its opulence, but also for being a kind of StatF-funded dating app. He employed gentlewomen of the bed chamber, a term that should have meant ladies in waiting, but really meant romantic shortlist. Entire political Alliances were derailed because Francis accidentally bedded the ambassador's wife. And this wasn't quiet, subtle. Adultery. Francis was loud about it. He once declared to foreign dignitaries that French kings were expected to be excellent lovers, which is noble sounding until you realize it came from a man who treated treaties and mistresses with the same level of commitment, which is to say temporary. His most famous affair was with Françoise d'Ivoire, a noble woman who became his official mistress. She was witty, educated, and likely the only woman who could roast him in public and survive. Eventually replaced because of course. She was followed by Indessel de Haley, a woman whose name sounds like a medieval inside joke and whose political influence was matched only by her ability to outlast the competition. Even his enemies couldn't help but notice. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once described Francis as more dangerous in the bedroom than on the battlefield. He meant it as an insult. Francis probably took it as a compliment. And somehow, amid the affairs, banquets, and what can only be described as diplomatic flirtation, Francis still managed to rule effectively. Though his wars were expensive and his taste in women even more so, the man was nothing if not enthusiastic. His reign was a whirlwind of silk, scandal, and second-hand perfume. Francis. I wasn't just a king. He was France's most seductive historical liability. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Alonso XI of Castile ruled from 1311 to 1350. And he had one major hobby besides ruling a kingdom, ignoring his wife in the most public, extravagant way possible. His poor, politically strategic wife was Maria of Portugal. Noble, well-connected, and unfortunately not Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alonso actually cared about. Leonor was a Castilian noblewoman with a sharp mind, 11 children, and enough influence to basically run the court herself. And unlike Maria, she didn't need a crown to feel important. She just needed Alonso's complete and shameless obsession. Now, most kings had mistresses. Alonso turned his into a shadow queen. He built Leonor palaces, gave her land, took her everywhere. Meanwhile, Queen Maria was left sitting alone at royal events like an unwanted centerpiece, while Alonso made googly eyes across the hall at his side chick, who was not even trying to be subtle about it. To make matters worse, or better, depending on your tolerance for medieval soap operas, Leonor wasn't just a mistress. She was politically active, negotiating treaties, commanding respect, and producing heirs like it was her full-time job, which, let's be honest, it kind of was. Alfonso refused to even pretend Maria mattered. In fact, he only spent time with her once, and it was purely for diplomatic optics. After that, he retreated to Leonor's estate like a man allergic to marital obligations. This didn't sit well with Maria's dad, who happened to be the King of Portugal. At one point, international relations got so tense over the whole situation that a war nearly broke out. Imagine your in-laws being so mad about your mistress, they consider military retaliation. But Alonso didn't care. He continued parading Leonor around court like a royal trophy and probably would have kept it up forever if the Black Death hadn't killed him in 1350. That's right. It took a literal plague to end his affair. After Alonso died, Queen Maria finally had her moment. She had Leonor imprisoned and executed in a move that historians call vengeful, and most of us would call extremely fair. Alonso's reign may be remembered for military victories, but let's be real. His true legacy was being one of the most publicly whipped kings in medieval history. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, and no, not in the personality sense, ruled from 1285 to 1314. His nickname came from his good looks, which were unfortunately not matched by good behavior. Outwardly, Philip was pious, serious, and all about moral reform. Inwardly, he was running a kingdom like it was a very tense reality show, complete with betrayal, secret trials, and a healthy dose of double standards, especially in the bedroom department. His most infamous scandal was the Tour de Nesle affair, a medieval sex scandal so messy it could have been scripted by HBO. It all started when Philip's daughter Isabella, yes, the same one who would later overthrow Edward II of England, noticed that her sisters-in-law were being a little too friendly with some knights. Suspiciously friendly, like matching gift exchange and secret tower rendezvous friendly. Isabella tattled to Philip, who launched a royal investigation with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. 2 of the princesses married to Philip's sons were found guilty of adultery and publicly imprisoned for years. Their heads shaved, their titles revoked, and their reputations completely annihilated. The 2 knights involved, tortured, flayed, and executed in the public square because nothing says moral leadership like turning a family affair into a medieval snuff film. Now, here's where things get interesting. While Philip was handing out brutal punishments like candy, rumors swirled that he himself kept a few mistresses tucked away in private rooms of the Louvre, no less. Some whispered that he maintained a secret group of young women who were available to entertain visiting dignitaries for diplomacy, of course. But unlike his daughters-in-law, nobody ever questioned the king's private affairs. Because when you're the one writing the rules, it's amazing how sin becomes strategy. Philip also had a special knack for using religion when convenient. He went after the Knights Templar for supposed heresy, but everyone knew it was about their money. It was the medieval equivalent of arresting your banker and calling it divine justice. So yes, Philip may have looked like a model of piety and honor, but behind that sculpted jawline and royal glare was a man with a deep commitment to hypocrisy and a working knowledge of where all the castle's secret doors were. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, was the kind of man who collected crowns the way other men collected wine goblets, which he also collected enthusiastically. Reigning from the late 14th to mid-5th century, Sigismund was smart, multilingual, and politically savvy. He also had a personal life so scandalous it would make a tavern bard blush. 2. Begin with, Sigismund was married to Queen Mary of Hungary, a powerful woman in her own right, but marriage to Sigismund was more of a polite formality. He preferred his relationships less lawful, more frequent, and ideally not followed by conversation. His romantic side projects included noble women, lauresses, and at least one Italian opera singer long before opera existed, which speaks to his innovative spirit. Court officials often lost track of his mistresses. Not because there were so many, but because they changed so frequently. Some historians suggest they just started numbering them. At court, his mistresses had their own quarters, servants, and in one case, a private chapel, which is either deeply romantic or just wildly inappropriate, depending on how you feel about praying next to someone's mistress. Sigismund also had a fondness for disguises, particularly dressing as a commoner and sneaking into towns. Sometimes it was for espionage. Sometimes to flirt with local women under the guise of being a very tall merchant. Apparently, nobody found this suspicious, despite him being the only merchant with a full entourage of servants wearing royal crests. And yet the man ruled for decades, launched crusades, hosted the Council of Constance, and reformed imperial politics, all while carrying on affairs. That would make even Casanova go steady on mate. One ambassador once wrote that Sigismund greets all women as equals, especially in private, which while vaguely progressive, also sounded suspiciously like an HR violation. But despite his extracurriculars, Sigismund remained immensely popular, mostly because he managed to appear regal in public while quietly running the most chaotic love life in Europe. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a one-man Renaissance, equal parts strategist, statesman, and scandal. And somehow he always got away with it. Louis X-15 of France, known as Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774. And by ruled, we mostly mean he hosted an endless royal afterparty where governance was optional and silk bed sheets were not. He started out promising enough, young, handsome, and poised to carry on the legacy of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV. But somewhere around his 20s, Louis decided national policy could wait because he had a long list of ladies in waiting to attend to. Let's talk about the Parc aux Cerfs, the quiet little house near Versailles that Louis used for, let's call them, private auditions. Girls were recruited, usually poor but pretty, brought in discreetly and rotated like seasonal produce. There were so many mistresses, the palace guards likely had a clipboard system. His most famous mistress, Madame d'Ampador, wasn't just a pretty face. She basically ran France behind the scenes. But when she lost interest in the physical side of their relationship, Louis said that's fine. And built a second harem instead. The logic: keep Pompadour for brains and banter. Keep the parquet for everything else. It was all very organized chaos. Each girl received gifts, titles, and in some cases, discreet housing once their contract expired. It was France's most unofficial, but strangely efficient internship program. And the Queen, Marie Lachinska. She was around somewhere, mostly ignored. Once she stopped having children, Louise treated her like antique furniture. Too expensive to throw away, but no longer relevant to the room. The scandal at court was so normalized that nobles didn't ask if the king had a mistress. They asked how many. This week. Even foreign ambassadors gossiped in their letters about the turnover rate at Versailles. That's not a monarchy. That's a brothel with better uniforms. Ironically, Louis genuinely thought he was a good ruler between lavish balls, discreet pregnancies, and awkward silences with his wife. His reign, while not catastrophic, set the tone for his grandson, Louis XVI, who would later lose his head, possibly because Grandpa spent too much time thinking with the wrong crown. In the end, Louis X-15 left behind a debt-ridden France, a disillusioned court, and a royal reputation that could best be summarized as loved by women, loathed by accountants. Christian IX of Denmark ruled from 1766 to 1808, though ruled might be too strong a word. Wobbled through life while other people ran the country is probably more accurate. You see, Christian had a few issues. He suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and was not particularly interested in the whole being king thing, unless it involved chasing servants with cutlery, which he apparently found hilarious. This made him more of a royal mascot than a monarch. Now, Christian had a wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, a sensible young woman who expected a somewhat normal marriage. What she got was a husband who preferred masturbating in public, talking to his hand, and disappearing during state dinners to ride imaginary horses down palace corridors. It's unclear what broke first, her patience or his grasp on reality. Enter Jen Friedrich Struzzi, the king's physician. Smart, ambitious, and very interested in power, Strunzi quickly became the real ruler of Denmark. And somewhat awkwardly, the lover of the queen. Yes. That's right. Caroline Matilda went full soap opera and began an affair with her husband's doctor. And the king did not notice or care. Strunzi wrote the laws, signed the edicts, and kept Christian occupied with puppet shows, sword games, and gentle nudges away from sharp objects. It was perhaps the only love triangle in history, where one corner was just vaguely humming to himself in the background. Caroline and Strui even had a child together, possibly the king's on paper, definitely not his in practice. For a while, the two ran Denmark like a very progressive, slightly scandalous think tank. But royal courts are rarely chill places. Eventually, Christian's jealous mother-in-law got wind of the affair and staged a coup. Struens was arrested, tortured, and executed quite dramatically, while Caroline was shipped off to exile with her reputation in tatters. As for Christian, he returned to being a gently supervised liability, spending the rest of his reign in a kind of padded silence. His reign is remembered less for achievements and more for the sheer absurdity of it all, a king who ruled nothing, a queen who tried her best, and a physician who tried a little too hard. History calls it a constitutional crisis. We call it Europe's weirdest love story. Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, came back from exile with one clear agenda. Bring back fun, preferably with as many mistresses as humanly possible. Spoiler, mission accomplished. After surviving a civil war, hiding in oak trees, and living in continental poverty, Charles returned to England as king and promptly decided the nation needed a little less puritanism and a little more clothing-optional ballroom dancing. Parliament reluctantly agreed. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, Charles had dozens of official mistresses, and those are just the ones we know about. His most famous flame was Nell Gwyn, a sharp-tonged actress who once called herself the Protestant, __, just to differentiate herself from all the other mistresses. Honestly, iconic branding. Then there was Barbara Palmer, titled Countess of Castle Mine, who was less mistress and more palace fixture. She was openly kept in royal apartments, and had multiple children by Charles, all of whom were granted titles and land. Because nepotism is more fun when it's flirty. Charles didn't even pretend to be Pope. Clement V, pressuring the papacy to investigate. Clement hesitated, but Philip wasn't waiting. In secret, Philip orchestrated one of the most coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. He set a date, gathered his soldiers, prepared his torturers, and on one cold Friday morning in October 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. All across France, Templar knights were seized, interrogated, imprisoned, tortured. Confessions were forced. Some broke within hours, others resisted until their bodies did. It was treason wrapped in holy justice, and it worked. The public, once loyal, began to turn. The Pope, pressured and humiliated, found himself cornered. The tide had turned. Not in battle, but in politics, and the warrior monks, who once rode into enemy lines now sat chained in dungeons, accused of sins that no sword could defend. October 13, 1307. The day that forever cursed Friday the 13th in the Western imagination. At dawn, across every corner of France, armed men moved in silence. Their orders were clear. Arrest every Templar you can find. No warning, no resistance allowed. The king's justice had arrived. With Swords drawn and warrants sealed in secrecy, thousands of knights were dragged from their beds, some in full armor, others in prayer. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay was taken in Paris. Betrayed by the very kingdom whose crown jewels he had once safeguarded. Across cities and countryside, Templar commanderies were raided, their vaults cracked open, and their libraries seized. The charges were fantastical. Heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, sodomy, devil rituals. Most of it was invented whole cloth by Philip's lawyers. But in an era of fear and religious zealotry, it didn't need to be true. It just needed to be believable. And the Templars, they were silenced with fire and iron. Torture chambers lit up across France. Men were stretched, burned, crushed, flayed until their confessions dripped from them like blood. They admitted to whatever their inquisitors wanted, that they denied Christ, that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet, that they kissed one another in secret ceremonies. Under unbearable agony, even Grandmaster de Molay confessed, then later recanted. It was theater masquerading as justice. A king destroying his creditors by accusing them of sins so grotesque no one dared defend them. The Pope Clement V was humiliated. He had tried to mediate, but Philip had moved too fast. Too ruthlessly. Backed into a corner, Clement ordered his own investigation. Other countries like England and Spain hesitated. In many cases, the accusations were dismissed or the Templars released. But in France, the machinery of condemnation rolled on. Philip confiscated their wealth, though much of it mysteriously disappeared. Some whispered the Templars had moved their treasure. Others claimed it had never been found. Still others said the real treasure wasn't gold, but knowledge, secrets, relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. The Templars were no longer a brotherhood. They were fugitives, prisoners, dead men. Walking. The king had dealt his blow, not with armies, but with ink, fire, and lies. And the world would never look at the Red Cross the same way again. By 1312, the end was inevitable. The Knights Templar, once the most powerful military order in Christendom, had been reduced to broken men in dark cells. Their confessions, wrenched out under torture, were used as justification for what came next. And what came next was dissolution. Under intense pressure from King Philip IV, Pope Clement V formally disbanded the Templar order at the Council of Vienne in March 1312, the papal bull Vox in excelso, stripped them of their titles, their holdings, and their very identity. Officially, the Templars were no more. The Holy See declared it an act of mercy, not a conviction, but a necessary step to prevent further scandal. In reality, it was a political execution dressed in ecclesiastical robes. The order's properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but not everything made it there. Much of the Templars' wealth, treasures, ledgers, and rumored relics simply vanished. Some claimed it was hidden. Others believed it was quietly absorbed by Philip's treasury. Whatever the case, the Templars' vast financial empire dissolved like smoke, leaving behind only questions. But the final act had not yet played. In 1314, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay, who had spent 7 long years in prison, was led out to a scaffold in Paris. He was to be executed alongside Geoffre de Charra, another senior Templar. Both had recanted their confessions, insisting until the end that the order was innocent, and for that defiance they would burn. They were tied to a wooden stake on a small island in the Seine. As the flames rose, de Molay shouted through the smoke, calling on God to judge those who had condemned him. According to legend, he cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement, declaring they would die within the year, and they did. Clement succumbed to illness within a month. Philip followed later that year, suddenly and without warning. Some whispered it was divine justice. Others called it coincidence. But the myth stuck. The Templars had died cursing their killers, and the heavens had listened. With that, the last true voice of the Knights Templar was silenced in fire. Their story ended not in battle, but in betrayal, torture, and flame. Yet, even as they were erased from the map, their legend was just beginning to take root. The fires of the Templar executions died out. But the embers of their legend burned hotter than ever. With the order disbanded, their castles seized, and their leaders executed, it seemed their story was over. But something strange happened. Instead of fading from memory, the Knights Templar transformed from disgraced monks into eternal symbols of mystery and power. The secrecy that had once protected them now fed rumors. What happened to their treasure? Where were their scrolls, their relics, their holy knowledge? Some believed the Templars had spirited away the Holy Grail before their arrest. Others whispered they had hidden the Ark of the Covenant or guarded descendants of Jesus himself. There was no proof. Just shadows. But in the medieval world, shadows were enough. Then came the idea that the Templars had survived underground. Though officially disbanded, many former Templars quietly blended into society. Some joined other monastic orders. Some became mercenaries, but others, legend claimed, went secret. They formed hidden brotherhoods, preserving their rituals and relics in silence, biding their time. Centuries later, those stories mutated into myths. The Templars were credited or blamed for everything from the construction of Gothic cathedrals to the founding of Freemasonry. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds. That the Templars controlled banks, thrones, revolutions. That they had never truly been defeated, just disguised. That behind every major event in history, some hidden hand in a white mantle guided the outcome. Pop culture didn't help. The Templars showed up in books, games, films, sometimes as heroes, other times as villains. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code turned them into custodians of holy bloodlines. Assassin's Creed made them a global cabal, pulling the strings of civilization. Each retelling distorted the truth, but fed the fascination. In reality, the Templars were flesh and blood, brave, yes, flawed, certainly religious warriors who tried to mix monastic vows with the violence of war and paid the price. But myths endure because they offer something history often can't. Answers, meaning, mystery. The real Templars died on scaffolds and in dungeons. But the mythological Templars, they still ride in the imagination. Eternal, armored, and cloaked in secrecy. And in that sense, Philip the Fair failed. He destroyed their bodies. But their legend untouchable. More than 7 centuries have passed since the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned alive on the banks of the Senator, but the Red Cross still lingers in literature, in architecture, in symbols carved into old stone and whispered through conspiracy theories. The Templars may be gone, but their legacy is anything but dead. They were more than just warriors. They were innovators. In an age when kings still ruled by divine right and banking was seen as a sin, the Templars created a pan-European network of finance, logistics, and diplomacy. Their letters of credit prefigured modern checks. Their commanderies functioned like regional branches of a multinational corporation. They were an early blueprint for globalization. Built not with stock markets, but with swords and sacred vows. Militarily, they redefined what it meant to be a knight. Before the Templars, chivalry was a personal code, flexible and often ignored. The Templars turned it into an institution, a discipline enforced with brutal consistency. They weren't lone champions jousting for glory. They were units trained like modern special forces, willing to die for an abstract ideal. And die they did, often in silence, sometimes in vain, but never without impact. Culturally, they changed how the West viewed religion and warfare. The concept of the warrior monk challenged the notion that holiness and violence were incompatible. They showed that belief could be weaponized, not just in battle, but in politics, finance, and propaganda. And when they fell, it was that same belief in their supposed heresy that justified their destruction. Their fall also served as a cautionary tale. The Templars became a symbol of unchecked power, answerable to no one. Protected by the Pope, richer than kings. Their downfall exposed the fragility of institutions, even those wrapped in divine authority. It was a medieval version of a corporate takedown executed not by shareholders but by royalty in Rome. Today their image is more myth than man. But myths shape memory. And the memory of the Templars, courageous, flawed, betrayed, reminds us that history isn't just written in victories. Sometimes it's etched in ash. So the next time you see a red cross on white cloth, remember it was once worn by men who believed they were doing God's work until politics, ambition, and fear decided otherwise. And in that clash of steel, gold, and fire, their legend was born. In 12th century Paris, the world was changing. Trade routes were expanding, universities were rising, and the church was flexing its muscles like never before. It was an age of ambition. Political, spiritual, architectural. And in the center of this rising city stood a dream made of stone. That dream belonged to Maurice Doully, the Bishop of Paris, appointed in 1160. He wasn't just a man of God. He was a visionary. The existing Cathedral Sainton was crumbling and unimpressive. Paris was growing and its religious heart needed to match the city's stature. So Sully dreamed bigger, much bigger. He proposed a cathedral so immense, so awe-inspiring it would dwarf everything around it. A monument not just to the Virgin Mary, but to the power and glory of the Catholic Church. In France, this wouldn't be a Romanesque fortress like the ones before it. It would be something new, something radical, something Gothic. In 1163, that dream began to take form. According to tradition, Pope Alexander III himself laid the first stone during a ceremonial blessing. Construction began on the eastern end, the choir and apse, where priests would one day sing hymns beneath towering arches of glass and stone. But this was no ordinary build. Notre-Dame wasn't just a building. It was a generational commitment. And so the people of Paris, stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, and artists, began the work. They hauled limestone from nearby quarries, shaped it with medieval tools and raised scaffolding that scraped the heavens. Every block was laid by hand. Every carving, every window, every rib of the vault, crafted with patience, faith, and sweat. It would take decades to complete even the first sections. Workers labored, knowing they would never live to see the towers finished. Sons inherited chisels from fathers. Generations passed with Notre Dame still rising slowly, gloriously above the Parisian skyline. But for Bishop Doully, the goal was clear. To build a house of God so magnificent that merely entering it would humble the soul. NRAM was never meant to be just a church. It was an act of worship carved in stone, a testament to what humanity could build when it aimed for heaven. The first stone was only the beginning. What came next would reshape the skyline and the soul of medieval Europe. As the 1170s unfolded, Notre Dame began to rise, not as a structure, but as a symbol. In a city of narrow timber houses and muddy streets, the cathedral slowly took form, towering over the skyline like a stone sermon. The Gothic style, still in its infancy, was about to redefine what churches could be. Not just shelters of prayer, but instruments of awe. The work moved from east to west, beginning with the choir, where priests would one day perform sacred rites, and then to the nave, the vast open space for the common faithful. The architecture was revolutionary, the walls were thinner, the ceilings higher. The pointed arches allowed more weight to be shifted downward, and those ribbed vaults. They didn't just support the ceiling, they sang upward, drawing the eye and the soul toward heaven. But perhaps the most radical idea was light. Unlike the dim Romanesque churches of old, NRAM was built to glow. Massive stained glass windows began to appear, filtering colored light into sacred geometry. Scenes from scripture burst into life with the rising sun. The church wasn't just telling stories anymore. It was illuminating them. Every piece of Notre Dame had meaning. The columns weren't just supports. They represented saints. The archways weren't just decoration. They were passageways to salvation. The stone was theology and the masons were its scribes. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Paris was transforming. The cathedral became a heartbeat. Markets clustered around it. Sermons echoed across the senator. Students from the burgeoning University of Paris gathered in its shadow. Notre Dame wasn't just a building. It was becoming the soul of the city. Yet progress was slow. There were no cranes, no power tools, just muscle, wood scaffolding, and endless resolve. Hundreds of workers toiled year after year. When one died, another took his place. Names were rarely recorded. Their reward wasn't fame, but faith. They built not for themselves, but for God and generations unborn. By 1200, the choir and much of the nave stood tall. The outlines of a miracle were taking shape. Notre Dame was no longer a dream. It was stone and glass, sweat and prayer. And just as the structure reached skyward, so too did the ambitions of its builders. Because what they planned next would defy gravity and reason. Notre Dame was unlike anything the city had ever seen, but it was also dangerously ambitious. As the walls rose and the vaped ceilings expanded, a problem emerged. The weight. The stone ceilings pressed outward, not just downward. The higher the vaults climbed, the more they threatened to push the walls apart. Traditional Romanesque churches solved this with thick walls and tiny windows. But Notre Dame was built to breathe, to glow, to reach the heavens. In both spirit and space. That's when the Masons did something revolutionary. They took a bold architectural idea, one barely tested at the time, and ran with it. The flying buttress. These weren't mere supports. They were external arms of stone, arching from the upper walls down to solid piers standing apart from the main building. Like skeletal wings, they braced the cathedral from the outside, transferring the outward force of the ceiling into the ground where it could do no harm. From the ground they looked impossibly delicate, like lace made of limestone. But they were engineering genius, and they allowed NRAM to become what it was always meant to be, a structure of air, light, and impossible height. The use of flying buttresses changed everything. With the pressure off the interior walls, the builders could add even more windows. The great rose windows, vast wheels of stained glass depicting saints, angels, and apocalypse were no longer a dream. They became reality. Color exploded into the sacred space. And God's stories now came not just from the pulpit, but from sunlight itself. Ironically, the original plans for Notre Dame didn't include flying buttresses. Early Gothic builders hadn't yet grasped their full potential. But as the structure grew, so did the strain. The masons adapted on the fly, literally. They began adding these stone wings in the early 1200s, turning necessity into poetry. Critics at the time were divided. Some thought the exposed supports were unsightly, interrupting the clean silhouette of the building. But most stood in awe. Notre Dame looked like it was being held in place by stone angels mid-flight. The cathedral was no longer just a house of God. It was a living demonstration of what faith and math could build together. A hymn carved in gravity-defying limestone, and its wings had only just begun to spread. By the early 1200s, Notre Dame had already transformed the Parisian skyline, but its most iconic features were still taking shape. As the eastern end neared,